The sun was already setting when the bus pulled up in front of the tall concrete walls. The man inside sat quietly, hands cuffed, looking out the window. He wasn't scared, just unsure of what to expect. This wasn't his first time behind bars, but something about this place felt different. The walls were higher, the guards looked colder, and the noise that came from inside wasn't the kind that faded easily. It was a mix of shouting, metal doors clanging, and the sound of people trying to make themselves heard in a place where no one really listened. When the gate opened, he stepped off the bus, the smell of the prison hitting him like a wave. Sweat, metal, and old cement. A guard told him to keep his eyes forward and his mouth shut. He did. The walk through the hallway felt endless. Every few steps a door buzzed open, then locked behind him again. He could feel eyes on him through small glass windows. Inmates already judging, already deciding what kind of man he was. When he finally reached his cell, the door slid open with a loud click. The room was small. A metal bed, a thin mattress, a toilet in the corner. The man nodded once at the guard and sat down. He looked at the scratches on the wall, names and words carved by others who had been there before him. It was quiet for a moment. Then he heard someone in the next cell ask where he was from. He didn't answer right away. He had learned that in places like this, talking too soon could get you noticed for the wrong reasons. Over the next few days, he kept mostly to himself. He followed the routine. Wake up early, line up for count, eat, and then head to the yard. The yard was the heart of the prison where everything happened. Some men worked out, others walked in groups, and some just sat under the small patch of shade pretending they didn't care who watched them. He noticed how people grouped up naturally. There were invisible lines drawn between them. Lines that no one talked about but everyone respected. He saw how men only sat at certain tables during lunch, how they spoke in low tones, always checking who was nearby. Even a handshake meant something here. If you shook the wrong hand, it could mean trouble. The man kept his distance, studying it all quietly. He could see that there were leaders, men who didn't talk much but had others around them who did their talking for them. The guards watched from their towers, pretending to keep order, but the real control was in the hands of those on the ground. One afternoon, while sitting in the yard, an older inmate walked up and offered him a seat. The man hesitated but then nodded. The older inmate spoke calmly, asking about his time, his charges, and what block he was in. The questions seemed harmless, but the man could feel they were more like a test. In prison, even simple questions carried meaning. He gave short answers, nothing extra. The older inmate smiled faintly and told him something that stuck. Keep your head down and don't get involved in things that ain't yours. Those words became his rule. He ate alone, walked alone, and avoided trouble. But trouble had a way of finding people, especially those who tried to avoid it. One evening during dinner, a small argument broke out at the next table. It started over a piece of bread, one man accusing another of taking his portion. Within seconds, voices were raised and the guards came running. The man watched quietly as both inmates were dragged out. Everyone else went back to eating like nothing happened. It wasn't about the bread. It was about respect, about who could take from whom. Days turned into weeks, and the man began to notice how tension built up over the smallest things. If someone borrowed something and didn't return it fast enough, it became a problem. If someone stared too long, it became a challenge. He learned that prison politics were like thin wires stretched tight. One wrong move and they snapped. Still, he stayed quiet. He used his time to read, write, and exercise in his cell. It kept his mind clear and his body strong. But being quiet also made people curious. One morning in the yard, a group of men approached him. They weren't aggressive, just curious. One of them asked why he kept to himself. Another said people were starting to wonder if he was with anyone. In prison, being with someone didn't just mean friendship. It meant loyalty to a group. He explained calmly that he wasn't with anyone, that he just wanted to do his time and go home. They nodded but didn't seem convinced. When they walked away, he could feel their eyes on his back. That night, lying in his bunk, he thought about how fragile peace was in there. Every person wanted respect, but no one wanted to give it first. It was a strange kind of world where pride could cost you everything, and silence could be mistaken for arrogance. He had seen men punished for saying too much and others punished for saying too little. It was a place where truth didn't matter. Perception did. One weekend, the prison was unusually quiet. Most men stayed in their cells, and even the guards seemed tense. The man later learned that two rival groups were on the verge of conflict. It hadn't started yet, but everyone could feel it coming. Inmates whispered in corners, passing messages, warning each other to stay ready. The man stayed out of it, but it was hard not to feel the weight in the air. The next day, during lunch, he saw one of the group leaders standing in line just a few steps ahead of him. Their eyes met for a brief moment. It wasn't hostility, but it wasn't friendly either. It was more like a silent reminder that he was being noticed. He looked away and kept moving. He didn't want to be part of anything that didn't concern him, but in prison, even not choosing a side was a choice in itself. At night, when lights went out, he could hear men talking in whispers, plotting, planning, and complaining. The sound of metal scraping, footsteps in the hallway, the occasional cough, all reminders that the place never truly slept. He would lie there staring at the ceiling, thinking about how strange it was that people on the outside thought prison was just about doing time. Inside, it was about survival, not just from violence, but from the pressure to belong, to choose, to prove something. One morning, a guard came to his cell door and told him he'd be moved to a different unit. No reason was given. Transfers were common, but they always meant something. When he arrived at the new unit, the air felt heavier. The men there were louder, rougher, and more territorial. He could tell right away that this was the block where the unspoken rules mattered most. One wrong word could change everything. That first night in the new unit, he sat on his bed listening. The man in the next cell was laughing with someone across the tier, but there was no warmth in it, just sharpness. He heard another voice say, "New guy, better learn quick." He didn't respond. He knew better than to react. As the days went on, he stayed alert, careful about where he walked, who he spoke to, and even where he looked. He could sense something brewing, something bigger than the small arguments he had seen before. The lines between the groups were getting darker, harder to ignore. Everyone was choosing sides, preparing for something they wouldn't talk about openly. And even though he tried to stay invisible, he began to realize something. In a place ruled by invisible politics, no one stayed invisible for long. It was only a matter of time before he would be forced to face the very thing he had been trying so hard to avoid. The new unit had its own rhythm, and it didn't take long for the man to understand it. The morning started early, before the sun had even climbed high enough to reach through the narrow windows. The sounds were always the same. Doors slamming open, guards shouting for count, footsteps echoing in the hallway. But underneath all that noise, there was something else, a quiet tension, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. The man tried to stay in the background. He had learned that blending in was safer than standing out. Still, the people around him didn't make it easy. Every block had its own groups, each claiming a different corner of the yard, a different row of tables, even a different line in the cafeteria. It wasn't written anywhere, but everyone knew where they belonged. Those who didn't follow those unwritten rules often paid for it later. On his second day there, he sat down at a table during lunch, unaware that it was already claimed by another group. The moment he sat down, the man across from him stopped eating and looked up. No one said anything at first, but the silence itself felt heavy. The man quickly realized what he had done. Without a word, he stood up, picked up his tray, and moved to another table. No one stopped him, but he could feel the eyes following him as he walked away. That was his first reminder. In here, respect wasn't about manners. It was about survival. Over the next few weeks, he noticed more about how the system really worked. There were people who controlled the phones, people who controlled the kitchen jobs, and people who decided who could sit where. Some men had been inside for so long that they acted like they owned the place. The guards knew it too, but they didn't interfere unless things got out of hand. It was easier to let the inmates police themselves. The man kept to himself as much as possible. But one day, that quiet approach caused him more problems than peace. During yard time, an inmate from another group came over and asked for a small favor. A simple thing like passing a message to someone in another unit. The man didn't think much of it and agreed. It seemed harmless. But what he didn't realize was that this small act would make people assume he was connected to that group. Later that week, he noticed a change. When he walked into the cafeteria, conversations quieted down. When he went to the yard, people looked at him differently. It wasn't open hostility, but it was enough to make his skin tighten. He had become part of something he never agreed to join. That evening, while he sat on his bunk reading, his cellmate leaned over and said quietly, "You need to be careful. People are talking. They think you're running with the guys from the east side." The man frowned. He didn't even know who the east side was supposed to be. He had no intention of being part of any side. He was just trying to do his time and stay invisible, but in that place doing nothing could still look like something. The next few days were full of small, tense moments. People stopped talking when he walked by. Some nodded at him respectfully and others glared. He could feel the invisible walls around him shifting. One morning during inspection, a guard whispered quietly, "Stay sharp today. Things are heating up." That kind of warning wasn't given lightly. During recreation that afternoon, he sat alone on a bench near the fence, pretending to watch a group playing cards. Across the yard, two men were arguing quietly, their voices low but sharp. It wasn't about what they said, and it was how they said it. He could sense the anger behind their words. Within minutes, both men were surrounded by their own groups. The guards noticed too and called everyone back inside early. That night, the prison went on a partial lockdown. The man lay in his bunk listening to the sounds from outside his cell. Guards moving quickly, radios buzzing, voices echoing in the hallway. He didn't know exactly what happened, but it was clear that the tension had finally started to break. When the lockdown ended 2 days later, the air felt heavier than before. The cafeteria was quieter. The yard was split down the middle, literally. Each group stayed to their own side. Even the guards seemed more alert, their hands always near their belts. The man walked carefully, keeping his head low. But no matter how careful he was, his small favor from the week before had already placed him in the middle of a silent divide. One morning he was called out for kitchen duty. It was a relief to be away from the yard for a while. The kitchen was noisy and hot, but at least the work kept his mind busy. He scrubbed pans, washed trays, and kept to himself. But trouble followed even there. One of the men working beside him suddenly leaned closer and said in a low voice, "I heard you've been helping the east side move messages. That true?" The man froze. He didn't know how to answer. Saying no could sound defensive. Saying yes could make things worse. He chose silence. The other man stared at him for a moment and then laughed. "That's what I thought," he said, walking away. The man felt his stomach tighten. Silence, once his safest choice, was now turning against him. That night as he sat on his bunk, he thought about how fast things changed in there. One small act, a simple favor, had made him a target of suspicion. It didn't matter what the truth was. In prison, people believed what they wanted to believe. And once a story started, it grew on its own. The next morning, during count, one of the guards stopped by his cell and said, "You got people asking about you. You might want to watch where you walk." The man didn't respond. He just nodded and looked down. That was the second warning, and it carried more weight than the first. As the days passed, he started noticing strange things. Someone had moved his shoes while he slept. His tray came late during dinner. Small things, but enough to make him uneasy. He realized that someone was testing him, trying to see how he'd react. He remembered the words the older inmate had once told him in the other block. "Don't get involved in things that ain't yours." But now it felt like he was already involved, whether he wanted to be or not. One afternoon in the yard, a man he had never spoken to before approached him. He looked calm, but there was something sharp in his eyes. "You got people thinking you're with them," he said quietly. "If you're not, you better make that clear before someone else decides for you." The man didn't know what to say. How do you clear your name in a place where words don't matter? He just nodded, but the other man shook his head. "A nod won't save you," he said, then walked away. The next few nights were restless. Every sound made him open his eyes. The air in the unit felt thick with unease. Men spoke in whispers, passing messages through the bars, plotting things that no one said out loud. The guards could feel it too, but they mostly stayed quiet, only stepping in when things got too loud. One morning, the man noticed two inmates shaking hands in the yard. Something simple, but full of meaning. Later, another pair did the same, and then another. It was a signal, one he didn't fully understand but knew wasn't good. He started avoiding the yard altogether, spending more time in his cell reading and doing push-ups to keep his mind steady. But even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. A few days later, he was sitting on his bunk when a note slipped under his door. It wasn't a letter, just a small piece of paper with 2 words written in pencil. "Choose soon." He stared at it for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't know who it came from or what exactly it meant, but deep down he understood. The invisible lines that divided the prison were about to turn into something real. He folded the note and hid it in his book. The choice he had been avoiding was now waiting for him, and no amount of silence could protect him anymore. The walls felt closer that night, the air heavier. He knew something was coming, something bigger than rumors, something that no one would be able to stop once it began. The next few days passed slowly, but the tension didn't fade. It hung in the air like a heavy fog, something everyone could feel but no one wanted to talk about. The man tried to act normal. He went to the yard, to meals, to his work shift, but his eyes were always moving. Every hallway felt tighter, every conversation shorter. People spoke in half sentences now, like they didn't trust anyone to hear too much. He still had the small note tucked away in one of his books. Choose soon. Those 2 words stayed in his mind all the time. He thought about tearing it up, but a part of him knew it wouldn't change anything. The warning was already inside his head. One evening during dinner, something strange happened. 2 inmates from rival groups sat near each other in the cafeteria. That was rare enough to make everyone look. No one said anything, but the energy shifted immediately. The man could feel it. It was the kind of silence that meant something bad was coming. The guards noticed too and called an early end to dinner, sending everyone back to their cells. That night, the prison went on lockdown again. The man lay on his bunk listening to the sound of boots in the hallway and radios crackling with code words. The guards were restless, moving faster than usual. Somewhere far down the hall someone shouted, but it was impossible to tell what was going on. By morning, things had calmed a little, but the unease was still there. The man's cellmate, who rarely spoke, finally said, "It's starting." The man asked, "What's starting?" but didn't get an answer. The cellmate just stared at the wall, silent. In the yard later that day, smaller groups began meeting in tight circles. Some of them were whispering, others shaking hands, making deals that would never be written down. The man sat alone, pretending to stretch, but he was watching. He noticed that the groups were no longer staying in their usual spots. The invisible lines that had kept them apart for months were fading, but not in a peaceful way. It was more like the calm before a storm. He tried to keep his distance, but distance in prison was tricky. One afternoon, while he was walking laps around the yard, 2 men approached him. He recognized one of them from the kitchen, the one who had asked if he was with the East Side. The man stopped walking, waiting. The taller one spoke first. "You've been quiet," he said. "That makes people nervous." "I just mind my own business," the man replied. The other man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "That's the problem. You keep minding your business so much, people start thinking you're doing someone else's." The man didn't answer. He didn't want to argue. He just nodded and kept walking. The 2 men let him go, but he could feel their eyes on his back the whole time. That was when he realized that silence could be as dangerous as speaking too much. Over the next week, the small signs grew louder. More guards were posted near the yard. The cafeteria lines moved slower because of extra searches. Even the tone of the announcements over the loudspeakers sounded different, sharper, more cautious. Everyone could feel something building. Then one morning, during line-up for breakfast, things nearly exploded. Someone shouted from the back, and trays crashed to the ground. For a few seconds, the whole room froze. Then just as quickly, the guards stepped in, separating people and forcing everyone back to their cells. No one was hurt, but everyone knew it had been close. Too close. The man spent the next few days thinking about his situation. He had managed to avoid being part of any group, but now that was starting to feel impossible. If something big did happen, those without allies would be the easiest targets. Still, he didn't want to pick a side. Every side came with its own rules, its own enemies, and once you joined, there was no way out. One night, while lying on his bunk, he heard his cell door open. A guard stepped in quietly and said, "Pack your stuff. You're moving again." The man didn't ask why. In prison, questions didn't always get answers. He gathered his things, a few books, a toothbrush, and his folded blanket, and followed the guard. They moved through 2 locked gates before reaching another unit. This one was older, smaller, and much quieter. The man's new cell was at the end of the tier, close to the wall. His new cellmate was an older man with calm eyes. They exchanged a few polite words and then fell silent. The next day, during recreation, the older man asked, "You got moved because of what's happening, didn't you?" "I don't even know what's happening," the man said honestly. The older man gave a small smile. "That's what everyone says right before it happens." Over the next few days, the man learned that the older inmate had seen a lot in his time. He talked about how prison politics started as a way to keep order, to prevent chaos when the guards weren't watching. But over the years, it had twisted into something darker. "Now it's not about respect anymore," he said one night. "It's about control. And control always comes with blood." The man listened quietly, thinking about everything he had seen so far, the rules, the stares, the whispered warnings. He could feel the truth in the older man's words. The prison wasn't just a place to serve time anymore. It was a world of its own, with its own government, laws, and punishments, and that government was falling apart. A few nights later, something happened that made the tension real. During count, one of the guards noticed a commotion on the far side of the tier. Shouts echoed through the hall, followed by the loud buzz of an alarm. The man stood at his cell door, watching as guards ran past. They didn't say what happened, but everyone knew it wasn't good. When things finally quieted, word spread that someone from one of the major groups had been attacked. No one knew by who, but everyone had their guesses. The older inmate in the man's cell shook his head and said, "That's it. It's begun." The next morning, the yard was closed. Everyone was confined to their cells. The guards moved in pairs now, hands always near their radios. Even simple things like food delivery were slower, quieter. It felt like the whole prison was holding its breath. That afternoon, a guard dropped off mail, and among the envelopes was a folded piece of paper with no name on it. The man opened it slowly. Inside was a single line. "You were seen talking to him." There was no name, but he didn't need one. He knew exactly who him meant, the older inmate. Someone was watching. That night he couldn't sleep. Every sound made him sit up, alert. The quiet that used to comfort him now felt like a trap. The older inmate noticed and said softly, "You can't run from it. Just stay smart." But staying smart wasn't enough anymore. The politics had gone past rules and warnings. It had become something that lived in the air, something that didn't need words to move. The following morning, the lockdown was lifted. Everyone was allowed out for breakfast, but the mood was strange. The man took his tray and sat alone at a corner table. Across the room, he saw the same two men who had confronted him before. They were watching him again, whispering to each other. He looked away and focused on his food. Then suddenly the loud crack of a tray hitting the floor broke the silence. The entire room froze. For a second, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. The guards rushed in, shouting commands, pushing everyone back. The man dropped his tray and ducked as people started yelling. He couldn't see who started it or why, but he knew this was it. He was shoved from behind and stumbled toward the wall. Before the guards could take full control, everyone was forced down. The man pressed his hands to the ground, heart racing, trying not to draw attention to himself. After a few tense minutes, the shouting faded. The guards pulled several men away in restraints. When the room finally cleared, the man saw what had happened. It hadn't been random. It was a message. The balance inside the prison had broken. Back in his cell, he sat in silence, staring at the floor. The older inmate didn't say anything for a long time, then finally muttered, "Now you see what happens when politics run too deep?" "Nobody wins," the man didn't answer. He just nodded slowly. The unspoken rules, the warnings, the invisible lines, all of it had led to this moment. And deep down, he knew it was far from over. Something worse was still coming. The next few days were unlike anything the man had seen since arriving at the prison. The air felt heavier, and even the guards seemed uneasy. Every sound echoed louder. The slamming of doors, the rattling of trays, the echo of boots down the hall. It was as if the whole place was waiting for another spark, something to set everything off again. The man stayed quiet, keeping his head low, but his thoughts never rested. He kept thinking about what the older inmate had said. Nobody wins. Those words made sense now. The fight in the cafeteria wasn't just a random moment. It was the start of something that couldn't be undone. That night, from his cell, he could hear voices from down the tier. Men were whispering through the cracks of their doors, passing messages in ways only long-timers knew how. He couldn't make out every word, but he caught enough to know that sides were being formed again, stronger than before. Whatever fragile peace had existed was gone. The next morning, the guards announced that the yard would remain closed until further notice. That was never a good sign. The yard was where men released their anger, their boredom, their energy. Without it, the tension inside the units only grew. The man spent most of the day pacing his small cell, counting the steps between the wall and the door. His cellmate sat quietly, staring at the floor as if deep in thought. By the second day, the silence became unbearable. People started shouting through their doors, arguing over things that didn't matter. The man tried not to listen, but he could hear the fear behind the anger. It wasn't about food or space, and it was about what was coming next. That evening, a guard stopped by their cell during rounds. "You two stay put," he said in a low tone. "We're hearing things. Don't get caught up in it." The man nodded but didn't ask questions. Guards rarely warned anyone unless something serious was about to happen. Later that night, just before lights out, someone slipped a piece of folded paper under their door. The man picked it up and opened it carefully. It was written in shaky handwriting. "They think you helped them. Watch your back." He stared at the note for a long time, his chest tight. He didn't know who had written it or what exactly it meant, but the message was clear enough. The story about him being connected to one side hadn't died down. It had grown. He showed the note to his cellmate, who looked at it quietly and said, "That's how it starts." Rumors turned to plans. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every sound in the hallway made the man sit up, his heart racing. The darkness inside the cell felt alive, filled with worry. He thought about how strange it was, how words and whispers could become more dangerous than weapons. The following morning, the lockdown continued. The prison was silent except for the occasional loudspeaker announcement. No one was allowed out of their cells except for meals. When the guards finally opened the doors for breakfast, everyone moved quickly, eyes darting, hands clenched around trays. Even eating felt like walking through a minefield. At one table, two men from different sides exchanged harsh words. It didn't escalate, but the entire room tensed up instantly. Everyone watched. No one breathed. The guards noticed too and separated them before things could explode. But it was only a matter of time. By afternoon, the yard finally reopened, but only in small groups. The man was in the third group allowed out. The air outside felt strange, calm on the surface but thick with tension underneath. He walked a few slow laps along the fence, trying to stay out of the way. He could see the others gathered in small groups, whispering, watching. It wasn't like before. The separation was sharper now. Every corner had its own set of eyes. The man's gut told him to stay near the edge, where he could see everything coming. A few minutes later, one of the men he recognized from the cafeteria approached. His tone was calm, but there was something hard behind his eyes. "You got a choice to make," he said quietly. "You keep walking alone and someone's gonna decide for you. You understand?" The man didn't respond right away. He just looked at him, then said softly, "I don't want to be part of anything." The other man sighed. "That's not how this place works anymore." Then he turned and walked away. The man stood there staring at the ground. He knew the truth. Neutrality didn't exist here anymore. He could either pick a side or be seen as the enemy of both. But choosing meant betraying who he was. That night, things took another turn. Around midnight, loud shouting echoed from one of the tiers. The man jumped up from his bunk, his heart pounding. The guards rushed in, their radios crackling, doors slamming open and shut. It lasted only a few minutes, but the noise was enough to keep everyone awake for hours. No one knew exactly what happened, but by morning word spread fast. Someone had been hurt badly. The prison went on full lockdown again. Meals were passed through small slots in the doors. There was no yard, no phone calls, no movement. Days began to blur together. The man kept thinking about how quickly things had changed, from quiet tension to chaos. During those long hours, he talked more with his cellmate. The older man shared stories from years ago, times when the same kind of power struggles had nearly torn the prison apart. "It always starts the same," he said. "A rumor, a lie, a misunderstanding. Then pride takes over, and before you know it, no one remembers what they were fighting about." The man listened silently. Deep down, he understood that this wasn't about gangs or sides anymore. It was about control. Who held it, who lost it, and who got caught in between. On the fourth day of lockdown, the guards came around for searches. They checked every cell, flipping mattresses, inspecting books, and removing anything that could be used to cause harm. When they left, the man noticed his book. The one with the old warning note gun was missing. It wasn't the loss of the book that bothered him. It was what it meant. Someone had been in their cell, touching his things, reading his messages. That evening, as the prison lights dimmed, a guard quietly stopped by again. "They're moving people tonight," he said softly. "Just stay ready." Before the man could ask anything, the guard was gone. A few hours later, the sound of doors opening echoed down the hallway. The man sat up as two guards stopped outside his cell. "Pack your stuff," one said. "You're being moved." He didn't argue. He packed his things quickly and followed them down the hall. This time he was taken to a section called protective custody, a place for inmates who were in danger, or who the administration thought might be. The new cell was cleaner, smaller, and quieter. The man sat on the bunk staring at the wall. He didn't feel safe, not really. The move had come too late. He knew that once the rumors had started, they wouldn't die easily. For days he stayed there, away from the others, listening to the faint sounds from the main block. Sometimes he could hear shouting, sometimes alarms, sometimes just silence, the kind of silence that carried its own weight. From the small window in his door, he could see the hallway, guards moving back and forth, tension written all over their faces. The older inmate he had shared a cell with wasn't there anymore. He didn't know if he had been transferred, released, or worse. The uncertainty gnawed at him. One afternoon, a young officer stopped by and said quietly, "You're lucky you got moved when you did." The man looked at him but didn't ask for details. He didn't want to know. Later that night, lying on his bunk, he thought about everything that had happened. The stares, the whispers, the warnings. All of it had built up to this. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of being caught in something that wasn't his. Tired of being forced to pick sides in a world where there were no real sides. Only survival. He realized that the worst part wasn't the fear of violence. It was the feeling of being powerless, of watching the place swallow itself from the inside. The politics that everyone spoke about weren't just about control. They were about pride, about needing to feel strong in a place designed to make people feel small. As he closed his eyes, he thought about the day he had arrived, quiet, careful, determined to stay invisible. Now, no matter how still he stayed, the prison had found him anyway. And deep down he knew it wasn't over yet. Something inside the walls had cracked, and once that happened, there was no going back. Days turned into weeks, and the man remained in the quiet section, cut off from the noise and danger of the main prison. The silence was strange at first, but over time, he began to understand why some people chose it. It was the only place where you could think without fear of what might happen next. Still, being isolated didn't mean being free. The memories of what happened on the other side of those walls followed him like a shadow. Each morning, the same routine played out. Breakfast slid through the slot. A few minutes of conversation with the guards and long hours of staring at the ceiling. Time moved differently in there. It wasn't marked by clocks, but by footsteps, by the sound of keys, and by the change in the tone of voices outside. Sometimes the man would catch bits of conversation between the officers. That's how he learned what had happened after he was moved. There had been more fights, more lockdowns, more transfers. A few people were sent to other prisons, others to the hospital. It had spiraled far beyond where it began, all over pride, misunderstanding, and the need for control. He sat on his bunk one afternoon, holding a small notebook the guards had allowed him to keep. He had started writing down the things he remembered, not to tell anyone, but to make sense of it for himself. Every time he put pen to paper, the noise inside his head got quieter. He wrote about the cafeteria fight, about the note under his door, about the fear that had crept through the walls like smoke. Writing it down made it real, but it also helped him see how fragile everything in that place really was. A week later, one of the guards he had come to know stopped by. The man looked tired, his uniform wrinkled. "They're talking about moving you again," he said. The man looked up. "Back there?" "Maybe," the guard replied. "Or maybe to another place altogether. Administration thinks the situation's calming down. They say it's safe now." The man gave a faint smile. "Safe?" he repeated. "In here?" The guard didn't answer. He just gave a slow nod and walked away. That night, the man couldn't sleep. He lay awake thinking about what safe meant in a place like that. Safety wasn't about walls or guards. It was about trust, and that was something this place had lost long ago. 2 days later, the move happened. They escorted him down the long hallway, through doors that clanged behind him. He was taken back to a different unit. Not the same one, but one that looked and felt just like it. The faces were mostly new, though some familiar eyes met his as he walked past. Whispers followed him, but quieter this time. His new cellmate was a younger man, quiet and polite. He didn't ask questions, just nodded and said, "You've been here before?" The man didn't confirm or deny it. He just sat down on the bunk and unpacked his few things. For the first few days, he kept to himself. The tension wasn't gone, but it was different. Less explosive, more like something that lingered beneath the surface. Everyone moved carefully, like walking on thin ice. Even laughter, when it came, sounded cautious. One evening, while waiting in line for dinner, one of the older inmates from the other side of the yard approached him. "You did the right thing," the man said quietly. "Getting out of the way." "I didn't have much choice," he replied. The older inmate shrugged. "None of us do. That's the problem." That short exchange stayed with him. He thought about how most people inside didn't want power or conflict. They just wanted peace, a bit of space to make it through the days. But peace wasn't something that lasted long behind those walls. It came and went like a weak signal, fading the moment someone felt disrespected or forgotten. Weeks passed. Slowly, the noise returned. The laughter, the arguments, the games on the yard. It was as if the place was pretending nothing had happened, but the man knew better. Beneath the surface, the same fears still lived. The difference was that everyone had learned how far things could go when pride took over. One afternoon, the warden called him to the office. That never happened before. When he entered, the warden was sitting behind a large desk looking at a thin file. "You've kept a clean record since the transfer," he said without looking up. "I try to stay out of trouble," the man replied. The warden nodded. "That's wise. We've had too much of that lately." Then he looked up, his eyes tired. "You've seen what happens when people let the wrong things run this place. I need men like you to help set a different tone. We're starting new programs, discussion groups, mediation sessions, ways to keep things from boiling over." The man didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure what to say. "You think they'll listen?" he asked finally. "Maybe not at first," the warden said. "But if no one tries, nothing changes." That night he thought about it long and hard. He had never imagined himself as someone who could make a difference in a place like this. But maybe after everything that happened, silence wasn't the answer anymore. Over the next few weeks, he started showing up to the meetings. At first, he just sat quietly listening. The others were cautious, skeptical. But little by little, he started speaking, not lecturing, just sharing. He told them about the fear of being stuck between sides, about how quickly everything could fall apart, about the cost of trying to survive in the middle of someone else's war. Some men nodded. Others said nothing. But the room felt different after he spoke. For once, the conversations weren't about pride or territory. They were about choices. About how everyone, no matter how deep inside they were, still had them. As time passed, the man noticed small changes. Fewer fights broke out. The guards seemed less tense. People started greeting each other again, cautiously but sincerely. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was something. One morning while walking the yard, the man looked around and saw the faces that had once been filled with anger, now filled with something quieter, maybe understanding, maybe exhaustion. He realized that everyone there had lost something to the prison politics that had gone too far. Some had lost friends, some their freedom within freedom, and some their sense of self. But maybe in their own way, they were starting to rebuild. Later that day, as he sat on the bench near the fence, a younger inmate came over. "They say you were around when it all went bad," the young man said. "I was," the man replied calmly. "Why didn't you just pick a side?" He thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Because when you pick a side, you stop seeing people as people. You start seeing them as enemies, and when that happens, nobody wins." The young inmate nodded slowly, not saying anything else. He walked away, but the man could tell the words had landed somewhere. That night, lying in his bunk, the man felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, even if just for a moment. He knew the system wouldn't change overnight. There would still be tension, pride, mistakes. But maybe now there was also awareness, and awareness, he thought, was the first step to something better. Months later, he was called again to the warden's office. This time the warden smiled faintly. "You're up for review," he said. "You've done good work here. The board's considering early release." The man didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "I've been here a long time," he said quietly. "Feels strange thinking about leaving." "That's how you know you've grown," the warden replied. A few weeks later, the man walked out through the same gates that had once swallowed him whole. The sun felt different on his skin, brighter, sharper. He looked back once at the high walls, the fences, the watchtowers, and then turned away. He didn't know what waited outside. The world had moved on without him, and he would have to find his place in it again. But as he walked down the long road away from the prison, he knew one thing for sure. He was leaving behind not just the walls, but the part of himself that once believed silence was the only way to survive. He had seen what happened when prison politics went too far. And he had learned that even in the darkest places there's still a chance, however small, and to bring something back to life.